Hey guys, today we've got another exciting game of Revised 40. This time we're going to have myself on the left playing Big Red against George, my opponent on the right, piloting Blue-Red Counterburn. So George takes the play, and I lead with a turn 1 Soul Ring. George follows up with 2 mountains and passes back to me. I play my mountains and tap 3 for a Basalt Monolith to try and get some big fireballs coming his way. Passing back to George, he draws a card for the turn. We'll see if he can find an island. Looks like he does, and goes for a Stone Rain, which will destroy one of my mountains. In response, I go for a Lightning Bolt targeting George, and the turn gets passed back to me. After a few passes back and forth, looks like I still haven't found another mountain, so this turn I decide to fire off a Fireball for 5. George goes with a Fork, which will copy the Fireball, and smack me in the face for 5 as well. Fork resolves, bringing me down to 15 and then putting George down to 12, and I pass the turn back to my opponent. My opponent on the right side now up to 5 lands, and passes back. Still haven't found that second mountain. Oh, there it is. So now I have access to 4 mana, and I can untap this Basalt Monolith. My opponent goes for a end of turn Lightning Bolt since it doesn't really look like I have any creatures. Plays land number 6, taps 6 mana for a Fireball of his own, dealing 5 damage to me, taking me down to 7. I untap my Basalt Monolith at the end of the turn. Now on my turn I go for a large Fireball of my own, taking George down to 5 and passing the turn back. My opponent, still having access to 6 mana, goes for a Shatter, which takes out Basalt Monolith, really limiting the amount of mana that I can make in a turn. So after that pass back to me, I tap 4 mana and play a Jayemdae Tome, so it doesn't look like I have the firepower to completely kill George. So we'll see if I can draw some off this tome. George doesn't have anything on his turn and passes back. And I pay 6 for a Fireball for 5, so we'll see if George has a counterspell. And it looks like he does not. He has a Fork which can copy the Fireball, but no counterspell.
No, don't touch it.
I was just pointing at it.
Well, don't point even.
Don't even point?
No, it can't be played.
So Big Red takes down game number 1. Heading into game number 2, my opponent is going to be on the play again this time. George leads with a mountain and passes back. After a few passes back and forth, George goes for a Stone Rain, and I decide to copy it with a Fork of my own to destroy his only red source. So 2 lands get taken out there, one by the Stone Rain and one by the pretend Stone Rain.
You know what? Imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, so I thank you. Identity theft is not a joke, Jim.
After a few more passes back and forth, I play a Basalt Monolith, which is countered with a Power Sink from my opponent's side. I don't have enough mana to pay for it, so Basalt Monolith goes to the graveyard. Still doesn't look like George has found another mountain, so unfortunately not able to cast any red spells. On my turn, I go for a Black Vice. My opponent is getting a lot of cards stuck in his hand since he doesn't have access to red, so lots of cards to feed this Black Vice. I think what to do here and eventually decide to go for a Mana Flare. Mana Flare would double both of our manas, but George decides to go for a Power Sink. Land number 5 for my opponent and gets a Brain Geyser for 3, probably looking for another mountain or some way to respond to the next threat that I might try to deploy. I have a lot of cards in my hand at this point, so I just go for a Fireball for 4, taking George down to 16, and 1 off the Black Vice there. My opponent finally finding a mountain, going for a Stone Rain on one of my mountains. Doesn't seem that impactful late in the game, but does take my fireballs down a bit. So I go for a Soul Ring, tap for 5, and cast another Fireball for 4, bringing my opponent down to 11.
We need that extra push over the cliff. You know what we do?
Put it up to 11.
11, exactly. One louder.
Why don't you...
On George's turn, he taps 3 and goes for yet another Stone Rain, even further limiting the largeness of the fireballs that I can cast. Passes the turn back to me. I tap for a red and go for another Black Vice. My opponent doesn't have a ton of cards in hand at this point, so Black Vice not doing any damage, but does prevent any future card drawing, or at least stops it if he doesn't want to take any damage. Back on my turn, I tap 4 for that Jayemdae Tome to start looking for some more threats. George, knowing that I can get out of hand with this drawing extra cards, goes for a counterspell and an end of turn Lightning Bolt. After a few passes back and forth with neither player being able to do anything, I go for a Fireball on George. And it looks like he has 2 copies of Fork, so able to copy that Fireball twice, dealing a lot of damage to me, putting us both down to 5 life. Now both of our decks in top deck mode, so it's just a matter of who can draw a Fireball first. And it looks like the answer is George. So I lose game number 2 to a Fireball from my opponent's side. Moving into game number 3, I'll be on the play on the left side with my opponent taking a mulligan to 6. I lead with a Mountain and a Black Vice. My opponent able to save on a little bit of damage there since he did mulligan, only having 6 cards in hand instead of 7, so Black Vice taking him down to just 18 instead of 17. After a couple passes back and forth, I go for a Basalt Monolith to power up some fireballs, and George goes for a Power Sink. After a couple passes back and forth with neither player being able to do very much, I go for a Fireball for 4, which is met by a Power Sink from the blue-red Counterburn side, and I pass the turn back to my opponent. My opponent goes for a 5th land and passes back to me. I go for another Black Vice, which is not met with a counterspell. My opponent's still out of range, not having a lot of cards in hand, but it does prevent any future Brain Geysers for large amounts of cards. Back on my turn, I pay 5 for another Fireball, which is counterspelled this time. George not wanting to take any unnecessary damage and probably wanting to just get cards out of his hand so that he doesn't take damage from those Vices. My opponent taps 3 and goes for a Stone Rain on one of my mountains, further limiting the size of my fireballs. And it looks like the Stone Rain is forked, so 2 lands destroyed there.
This is getting out of hand. Now there are 2 of them.
Me having 3 lands is not great for a deck that likes to play lots of fireballs, so we'll see if I can find a Soul Ring or a Basalt Monolith. Back on my opponent's turn now, George has a Fireball of his own, that fork really hurting my ability to actually do anything, so my opponent now just trying to kill me as quickly as possible before I can reassemble my mana base. Back on my turn, I go for a Fireball for 3. I don't have any lands in hand at this point, I'm just trying to draw them off the top of my deck, so as many cards that I can get out of my hand, I will cast as quickly as possible to try and not get them countered. Passing back to my opponent, George gets to untap his lands, plays his 7th land for the turn, and passes the turn back. On my turn, I go for a Soul Ring, which can hopefully make some larger fireballs in the future. Still no extra lands in hand, I just have to draw them off the top of my library. So I do have access to 5 mana at this point. We'll see if I have something like a Jayemdae Tome or a Fireball. And there it is, so a Fireball for 4, taking my opponent down to 7. George going for an end of turn Lightning Bolt, taking me down to 12. My deck is creatureless, and this is game number 3, so Lightning Bolt going face, definitely the right choice here. Tapping 3 mana for a Mana Flare, which will double the amount of mana that both sides can produce, and tapping 8 for a Disintegrate, and that takes game number 3. Mono Red Fireballs takes this one down. You're going to see a lot of red cards in our top 3. So in number 1 we have Fork, doing a ton of work on both sides, copying Stone Rains and Fireballs. At number 2 we have Mana Flare for sealing up game number 3 with a gigantic fireball. And at number 3 we have Stone Rain for preventing me from doing anything with my lands. If you enjoyed these games and want to check out the deck, the full list is in the description box of this video, and if you want to see more gameplay like this, be sure to check out the Revised 40 playlist. Thanks for watching, I'll see you guys next time.